official. It's a clean sweep for the GOP. The Republican Party now controls the House, the Senate, and of course the Oval Office. We have been talking a lot about the fallout among Democratic elites, how it all went so wrong for Kamala Harris. There have been two voices in the wilderness for almost a year.
We thought that Trump was going to win for months and months because it was obvious, where Joe Biden was a deeply unpopular, aging incumbent, thought it was asinine that the Democratic Party wasn't primarying him. And along came our guy, Dean Phillips, who was making that very, very case. And we said, you know what, let's do this. And I have to say now, everyone is saying, oh man, if Joe Biden had only gotten out sooner.
Correct.
And now it's like, where the were you in January when we were up in New Hampshire making this case? You were all probably penguin clapping, Joe's our guy.
That is Andrew Yang on his podcast Forward. Yang is a one-time tech entrepreneur who ran unsuccessful bids for mayor of New York and president of the United States in the 2020 cycle. Now, Congressman Dean Phillips of Minnesota has also been critical of the Democrats for more than a year. He was the first elected Democrat to break with party rank and file for calling for Biden not to run, or at least have a party primary.
Most Democrats know it. They've been feeling it. I think I'm the only one saying the quiet part out loud, Leland. I remember I think it was July of 2022, where I first said the president should pass the torch, cement his legacy. He did a fine job saving the country, I believe. And the only reason we're having these conversations right now is because he's running again. His next term would end in January of 2029. I don't think these conversations would be as significant if he had already decided to pass the torch, open the stage to a new generation, which is what he should have done. And it's sad to see.
Dean Phillips was treated horribly by his own party when he questioned Joe Biden in this most recent presidential cycle. I think he is owed a lot of apologies. The big question right now is who should lead the next generation of Democrats? And that is the decision that they're going to have to make. Like I just said, Dean Phillips was right. He was completely right. He was laughed at. He was scoffed at. They tried to humiliate him, and he was completely right.
He was. I mean, he called for a new generation of leadership, and the Democrats said we're not going to have a primary election. And a good example of what's going on right now was in the state of Florida. Dean Phillips, as well as Marianne Williamson and others who were running, wanted to be on the ballot. But instead, because the parties decide who would be on the Florida primary ballot, the Democrats only submitted Joe Biden's name. And as a result, there was only one candidate. State law says there won't be a primary. And so the Democratic Party canceled the primary election in the state of Florida. And a similar dynamic happened in other states, which Dean Phillips was referring to in that tweet. And so the key here is for the Democratic Party to be more democratic, to be able to hear from the voters, and that usually works out well. Like when you have a very competitive party primary, for example, in 2008, truly the strongest candidate emerges, like in that cycle, Barack Obama. So right now, the culture of the Democratic Party needs to change. This sort of top-down command and control structure is not serving people well, and it's not, importantly, it's not reading what the people want.
Yeah, the way the pro-Biden Democratic pundits approached this issue on TV was just incredible. They would say over and over again, no, he's the incumbent president, it is his, bend the knee now. That was their approach, even that there were signs back then that a majority of Americans, a majority of Democrats had questions about Joe Biden's, given his age, ability to serve a second term. That was well before the utter on-screen collapse of Joe Biden's prospects that validated the concerns voiced by people like Dean Phillips all along. So I agree with you. There should have just been a primary process. And then if he'd won it anyway, in a fair and open, if he'd done debates with these other candidates and won it like he won it fair and square in 2020, then you couldn't have said anything. And you said, well, he won it. Or if in that process it emerged that he was really slipping since last time, you might have had more of a time to have a different candidate arise, even a different candidate than Kamala Harris, perhaps, who did not end up being such a strong candidate. I mean, lost somewhat decisively. That could have all happened. On the Republican side, they tried to do this, by the way. They had an actual primary. It was not just handed to Trump this time. They tried to have an actual primary process. They had debates. He didn't attend them. He didn't care. He acted like it was just going to be his all along, and he did, in fact, win. But the party did try to have a normal nominating process where if someone can beat Trump, then it's going to be theirs. That didn't happen, but it was healthier for the party that they did it. And it ended up, the result was the party was more unified behind Trump than it has been in either of his two previous election cycles. But there was no dissent. He won, it was his, and he won his biggest victory yet.
The Democratic leadership lied to us. It's as simple as that. And for so long, you would hear Democrats talk about Republicans and the Trump dynamic, where privately they would say one thing about Trump, like he's insane, he's crazy, and then they toe the party line publicly. The same thing happened on the Democratic side,
right,
where privately everyone would say Biden's not up to this, and then publicly they say he is. I was in a relatively small gathering with Joe Biden back in February, and it was clear to me at that time, this is not going to happen.
Oof.
And at that point, the truth was going to come out at some point in this process. It finally happened with the debate. But I was predicting, even in the spring, that Kamala Harris would be the nominee, because I knew that you can't keep something like this secret for that long. And that's just not a service to Biden. It's not a service to the entire country. And I just think that there needs to be a real reckoning of what happened, because, look, anyone who was in a room with Biden could see it. I could say personally as far back as February.
That is incredible, because we were being gaslit
Yeah.
by Karine Jean-Pierre and other people who right up to the very end were saying that videos of him where he appears to be out of it, you're imagining this, it's manipulated, it's that kind of thing, and yes, one of those videos was like clipped in a way that it looked bad, and there was something he was looking at and it wasn't as bad as it looked. Fine, but the underlying reality was that people could see this man had very sadly and unfortunately declined in a way that happens to elderly Americans at when they hit different actual age landmarks. Some people can be still functioning and working past the age that Biden is. There are people in Congress older than him, like Bernie Sanders, for instance, who, while I disagree with all of his policies, I don't think has declined cognitively or physically or any way. But it just happens to people at different stages of their life. It clearly happened to Joe Biden. It's sad that it has, but it's also sad then to force him, strain him through this gauntlet that he's not prepared to do at a time where the world is really spiraling out of control. We need someone who has their finger on the pulse at all hours of the day, who can be roused in the middle of the night if for a Russian offensive against Ukraine or for news of bombs flying in the Middle East. It's just not. It doesn't seem correct for American stability to have someone who is so out of it, and that's ultimately what the American people decided.
And the key lesson to be learned here too is that politics, I describe it as like a living organism, and every action often has an equal and opposite reaction. And so when the Democrats are kind of subverting the will of the people and subverting the real ability to choose their candidate, that angers people. Mm-hmm. And that anger gets expressed in other ways, and people are repelled from that kind of dynamic. And, there were populist Democratic voters who actually started supporting RFK Jr. around that time. And maybe with RFK Jr.'s endorsement of Trump, a few more went in that direction. But the point being that people don't want the elites to be telling them what to do and what to think and making choices for them. This is a democracy, and it should be a bottom-up process.
So you've been a Democratic political candidate. Where do you see the party going? Do you think they're learning the right lessons from this defeat? I think, frankly, some in the party are. I think some on not on MSNBC, they're not. It's all because we're all too racist and sexist to ever accept a Democratic leader like Kamala. But I am seeing from some Democrats a reckoning with maybe the party's cultural stances or perceived proximity to a really cultural progressivism having hurt them. Do you think the reckoning is happening and the party will be looking toward more promising leadership?
I would say the constructive reckoning is happening on maybe a third to a half of the Democratic leaders I've talked to, and then the other half is blaming voters and doing other things. But the truth is, this was such a sweeping victory for Donald Trump in terms of winning every swing state that it forces a reckoning regardless of what your reactions are. And I think what's likely going to happen over the next 4 years is you're going to have more energy towards insurgent candidates within the Democratic Party. And whether it's the names that you've heard more about, whether it's Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer, or some candidates that we've never heard about. And by the way, we were just talking about Andrew Yang. Is he going to potentially run as a primary candidate on the Democratic side? So I just think in a moment like this, similar to 2004, where Republicans had resounding victories, that caused Democrats to really kind of reassess where they're at, listen to voices they may not have otherwise listened to, and new leaders emerged, and that ultimately led to the election of Barack Obama.
Andrew Yang did almost win that New York mayoral race. There are probably some New Yorkers who wish he had eked that one out, given what's happening with the current New York mayor. We will definitely pay attention to Andrew Yang and Dean Phillips. Maybe there is a future for him, given that he was a little bit of a Cassandra on the Joe Biden fitness issue. Lots more to get into on Rising Today. Please stay with us. Thanks so much.